Welcome. My name is Salem. I'm part of the Mijente staff team, calling from DC. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We know there's been a lot happening in 2021. It's felt like decades in just a matter of weeks. And we know that last week, as we transitioned into a new administration and a new government, there's a lot of information that we're all trying to catch up with. Specifically around all of the executive orders. I think it's been 30 plus. And even more specifically, y'all are here with us to learn a little bit more about what we know and what we understand and how we're responding to all of the executive orders that have to do with immigration policies, right? So thank you all for being here. I am going to pass it over to our senior campaign organizer and my dear friend Jacinta Gonzalez, who's also part of our Mijente staff team, and hopefully will be able to answer a lot of your questions and offer us some framing, some analysis, and some next steps as we continue the struggle for immigrant justice and immigrant rights, which has been one of the key issues of Mijente since before we even were organization. So I'll pass it to you, Jacinta, and thank you all for being here, and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Salem and Kathy. As I said, my name is Jacinta, and it's so exciting to see so many folks on the call. And thank you to everyone who's on here on camera. We precisely went back and forth. Should we make it a webinar? Should we not? But it's actually, these are the moments where being able to be in community and see each other and know that there are real people that are in this fight with us is the most helpful and kind of gives us the most hope to continue moving forward. So yeah, thanks you everybody for just being here in that way. A couple of just housekeeping things before we or some caveats or disclaimers before we get into some of the explanation. A lot has happened just in a very, very short amount of time. I wish we could get into a detailed description and talking points about all of the things that have been happening with all of the executive orders, because there is so much there to unpack. But I think that we just wanted to kind of create a space to get a little bit more in depth and into the weeds about what is going on with the moratorium on deportations with that order, but also with the day one immigration bill and how those two things are playing together, so that we can really understand a full arc of strategy, and also so that we can figure out how we can continue to push forward, right? We are very excited about a lot of the announcements that happened, but we know that this is just, we are setting the floor, not setting the ceiling. And we know that the only reason we got here to begin with was because of organizing and because we were focusing on some of these really important issues, right? Around policing, around criminalization, around deportations, that for a long time were really ignored. And so we want to continue to push them to the forefront, celebrate the wins, and also use that as a launch pad to continue to figure out next steps. So I know that there's been a lot of stuff about what's been going on, for example, with the Muslim ban or with, deferred action for different groups from different countries, or, what's going on with DACA. We won't be focusing as much on those issues, but definitely if you have other questions or want to contribute other materials, please put them in the chat. What I'm going to be doing is I'll do a regular kind of a quick breakdown of what's going on. But if you have a particular question and you want to ask it out loud, just put yourself in the stack and we'll be able to call on people in different times in the conversation. So obviously a lot of people on here won't be able to answer every question, but we're going to try to get through as many as we can. So first, a little bit of history of how we got here, right? We talk about how organizing has been crucial in being able to create the conditions to make these wins possible. But I wanted to give folks a little bit of sense of how we are combining different strategies of organizing to get to this place. So as y'all know, in Mijente, we really believe that we need a multiplicity of strategies for building power and contending for power. And so that means that sometimes we're out in the streets protesting, doing civil disobedience actions, putting our bodies on the line. Sometimes that means we do electoral campaigns like Fora Trump or Georgia con Ganas, and are trying to mobilize our people to get to the ballot box. Sometimes we have to sit in wonky policy meetings to be able to make the case of why government officials have to continue to build some of these things. Sometimes we actually are building alternatives to some of these systems that we're trying to tear down. That multiplicity of strategies is really what allowed us to get to this place. So just even the fact that the demand to have a moratorium on deportations existed was also a cornerstone of some of the way that we approached electoral organizing. So some of y'all might have followed, we had back in 2020, Cheesemate 2020, right, where we got to sit down with some of the candidates. We were able to ask Bernie Sanders if he would basically support a moratorium on deportation. And that was the first time we were able to get a presidential candidate to agree to that. And that really kind of set the floor for them to continue to be able to have a ton of other organizations push Biden to make that commitment. But we can't forget that, Biden as a candidate, when he started, he was not on board, right? It was definitely movement that was able to push him to get to this place. And I think the other thing that's been really important is that within the immigrant rights movement, there's been a tremendous effort to really get people to understand criminalization more broadly and to understand that these dynamics or these narratives where we are saying that some immigrants are good and worthy of protections and others are, should be criminalized and should be thrown away are actually doing us a disservice. And having that sort of unity in the way that that advocates have been positioning demands has been really, really helpful. So I think this is just also a good moment for us to remind ourselves and kind of celebrate all of the times we had to have those conversations, all of the times we made those interventions, because you really could see the results in a different sort of conversation around immigration. We could have been in a situation where folks were only concerned about children in cages, and that was kind of the end of the frame. But it has been because we continue to push on these programs. And so it's just a good reminder, because I think, moving forward, we might start to see different groups start to say, well, let's not talk about it that way. Let's try to just celebrate this or that. I think we have to stay very clear in our principles of fighting against criminalization in all of its forms and making sure we're having a different conversation and really intervening in so many ways. So that's just a little bit of the background of just how we got here, the theories. It goes without saying, a lot of us who are now part of Mijente were part of the Not One More Deportation campaign. And so I also think that the legacy and the organizing that came out through that campaign and other moments of history has been really, really crucial at getting us also to this place. So I just wanted to give out those shout outs, especially with all of the groups present. So let's now talk about what actually happened. We got a moratorium on deportations from this administration in the first, day of coming into office. To be really, really honest and really blunt, a lot of us were like, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Will it happen tomorrow? So I just also want to kind of get folks to understand that there was literally like last minute pushing to make sure that it actually happened. And that there was a lot of conversations that were being had up into a couple of weeks about what are going to be the carve outs? Will it include enforcement? So I also just want to give this sense to people, especially folks who are kind of used to fighting against DHS and the administration, that there have been a lot of interventions that have been really successful. And that kind of also gives us a sense of how to push in the next phase of the fight. So the moratorium is, there's a couple of different talking points, like different headlines that people want to know, but there is a blanket moratorium or a pretty broad moratorium on most deportations. The thing to note about that is that they are now starting to make different exceptions or different kind of caveats to that. And that sort of tells us a little bit about where we have to push. So the first thing to know is that the effective date is from, the moratorium is included beginning on January 22nd, and it is for 100 days. This is a time-limited moratorium. People are some folks have wondered if it's permanent, if that means that there will no longer be deportations. The administration has not made that commitment, but they've only made a commitment for 100 days. But also, parentheses, at first they were saying it was going to be shorter. So they did actually extend it to the full 100 days. So again, just for people to understand a little bit of the wiggle room in terms of like where the demands are and what's going to be happening. The moratorium does not have a lot of carve outs for criminal record, except for these exceptions around terrorism, espionage, and danger to national security. So far, we haven't seen the administration use these carve outs in terms of my knowledge. So this is something that we do want to just be watching for to see if ICE starts to use those types of excuses in different cases. The thing that they have said that they're going to continue to deport are folks that were not physically present in the US before November 1st of 2020, or folks who have signed a type of waiver, or this idea of this consultation with ICE General Counsel. So again, the problem with these categories is that it gives ICE some discretion. The thing is, we still don't understand how they're going to be using it. The thing that it doesn't say explicitly here, but we have started to note in terms of flights that are being sent out, is that the administration is still doing Title 42 expulsions, which is a special code that they're able to deport people given COVID because of public health concerns or whatever the way that they're framing that. So that is something that is still really, really alarming and something that we have to watch for, because what that's doing is allowing ICE to still send out deportation flights. So I'm going to talk I'm just going to go through the basics of things, and I'll come back to like what we're seeing in terms of cases and how to fight cases, because I'm seeing some wonderful folks on this call who were participating and is trying to stop a compas deportation just this weekend. So there are start to be some indications of where we're going on that, but just wanted to give that kind of background for people. The second part of the moratorium that's important to note is that they do have interim civil enforcement priorities. And these are starting effective on February 1st. So again, it still has this carve out for folks that are engaged in or suspected of terrorism or espionage. But it also includes people who are being arrested at ports of entry, and also includes people who are being transferred who have aggravated felonies. Now, the concern here that we have is, within immigration law, this concept of aggravated felonies is very, very problematic because it puts a lot of focus on discretion at the hands of ICE agents. So aggravated felonies, the way we describe them is many times they don't have to be aggravated or felonies, right? So for example, if someone goes into a store and shoplifts and gets, a pack of diapers and a bottle of, formula, those might be 2 shoplifting charges, which would be crimes involving moral turpitude, which could be considered an aggravated felony. So this is something that we have to pay a lot of attention to in the next in the next 100 days, because this is the floor that they're setting for us, and this provides some opportunities for us to continue to organize and push back against that type of criminalization. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about like the path ahead in terms of deportation cases, but just wanted to sort of mention that those carve outs. Now, also included in the moratorium is this instruction to ICE to conduct an investigation on what their enforcement priorities are, to figure out how to, make adjustments and set up permanent priorities. This is what I would call in organizing terms, an organizing sprint. We basically have 100 days to really kind of, ahora sí que cause all hell, to make sure that investigation, that process of review actually includes the voices of folks that have been at the forefront of some of this. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit distracted by some of the questions, but we'll get to some of them in a few seconds. So this review process, again, we can't really trust DHS to conduct its own review process. We have a lot of experience with the agency. We know that a lot of the agents that are in the streets that are supervising decisions, they're the same folks that were there under Obama. It's the same folks that were there under Trump. And so there's going to be a lot of more, like they're going to be trying to do whatever they can to shut off different avenues for us to organize. And this is where we have to be really razor focused in terms of where we push back. So also in terms of things that we'll get to in a couple of seconds is what's going to be the organizing strategy in these 100 days to be able to push as much as we can to get to, for whatever those permanent priorities to be, to include as few people as possible, and to try to shut down and tear down as much as we can of the deportation machinery that exists up to now, right? So that includes getting rid of programs like 287G, making sure ICE doesn't use detainers anymore, shutting down Operation Streamline, really understanding what's happening with surveillance and technology and how that's being used to retaliate against organizers and create, the different target lists. So there's sort of a lot of space there that we can kind of have to be able to get into how we want to see this agency, reduced to the big, like as much as whittle it down as much as we can within the next 100 days, and set us up to also be able to have a lot of longer organizing fights moving forward. So I see a couple of questions here, and I'm actually going to start to take some of them so that we can get into some of these cases. So someone's asking is ICE ignoring the moratorium and still deporting people? So it's a mixed question. Basically, we have been seeing that ICE agents are going to, again, ground ICE agents are the same ICE agents that endorsed Trump, that have a union, that have been, enjoying the freedom that they had during the Trump administration. And so what we saw is a couple of cases where, for example, someone really clearly fit within the moratorium, and ICE agents were trying to say that they had voluntarily signed a deportation order, and so that was going to count as them being allowed to be released. This is obviously one of those cases where it's clear that it's local ICE agents who are trying to overturn. And the challenge for us was trying to get the new administration to crack down on that to stop the deportation. So who knows how many cases like that are slipping through the cracks, right? We have to be really honest, again, without someone kind of going into the flight and figuring out case by case, we can't trust this administration very far to do that. And part of the problem is that they're still doing flights with Title 42 folks. And so that's where they're able to kind of get away with it, because they haven't been able to ground every single flight. But from what we've been able to see is that when we are able to organize and do some advocacy, we were able to, for example, stop this one deportation case. So I think that there's opportunities there to organize. And I know some of us have been fighting deportation cases for a long time. We're like, oh, that's a rusty muscle. I was like, oh yeah, consulates, we got to call them. There's a lot of work that we just have to start to continue to do to be really vigilant on that. Because again, the issue with all of these orders is going to be accountability and creating the type of infrastructure we need internally within the administration, but also externally to be able to create some of those fights. And so folks are asking more specifics around the aggravated felony definition. So a case does not have to be labeled an aggravated felony in the criminal court for it to count that way by ICE. So again, that's part of the reason we have such issues with this definition, besides the fact that it's allowing for people to be criminalized, but also because it puts a lot of discretion in the hands of ICE agents. And whenever that happens, we know that the results are not going to be good for our community. And so we want to make sure that we're continuing to fight and expand on those. So I know we've already started to talk to a couple of folks and organizations that might be working on cases that they know. If you know of someone who's in prison or jail right now and is likely going to be released in the next 100 days, and that they might be considered an aggravated felony case, please let us know. These are the times, again, to be thinking about the ways that we took, using public deportation cases to be able to expand to push back against a lot of what's happening. And folks remember under Obama, for example, folks with prior orders, right, were considered priorities. The way of pushing against that was doing a lot of public cases to be able to push back against that definition. So a lot of those things have to come back up. But the one thing that we are expecting tricky ICE agents to start to do now is precisely to pressure people to sign this release or waiver to be able to deport them. So this is where all of the folks that are in communities that are doing Know Your Rights with our community, that are having those conversations, now is definitely the time to double down on don't sign anything, especially nothing that you don't like, especially a document you don't understand, and without having legal representation, because it probably won't be, that's going to be the trick that they've already started to do, and we'll probably try to do at a broader track. So some of these, okay. I think those are some of the main questions. So that's the general sense of where things are at with the moratorium. Does anybody want to ask a question on camera before I kind of talk about some of the things that we've been seeing coming out of Texas and some possible threats to this one that we see?
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. You can go ahead, JKJ.
Thank you. I submitted this question and I'd like to just ask it now again. If someone was told by the courts that they should self-deport because they were ineligible for sanctuary due to gang violence, and the person did not self-deport, will they be eligible for protection and eventually put on the citizenship track? They do have an INI number and have been paying taxes for many years, more than a dozen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So, from not being an attorney and having heard about 5 seconds about the case, what it sounds like is this person is eligible for the moratorium, right? Where they wouldn't be deported in the next 100 days. But I'll start to talk a little bit about this idea of the path to citizenship, because there's a lot more unclarity on that. That's going to be a longer process that's going to be determined by Congress and the Senate, and is going to kind of, what President Biden has introduced is kind of just the starting point of a long process, and we don't know what the final result of that is going to be. So it's kind of impossible to sort of ask that question. It's kind of impossible to answer that part of it. But in terms of the moratorium, it sounds like they probably would be eligible to not be deported, at least in these first 100 days. And then we got to see what's going to be the priorities for the administration moving forward to be able to know if that person would get protections from deportation in the long run. I'll also say, I know a couple of folks are starting to ask me, just ask me if you can ask me a private question or like other case specific questions. Definitely happy to answer those. I'm gonna ask folks to put my email in the chat, so you can just hit me up privately and we can have a conversation around that, because I know sometimes it's hard to get into the weeds on different personal cases. So want to kind of hold those off to be offline as much as possible. I think there was one other question before we move on to precisely the attacks that are happening in terms of the state of Texas, and then around some of the day one bill and go from there.
My question is also regarding the path towards citizenship. So I'm documented. I was born in the States. My boyfriend has been in the States for 3 years now. There's no record of him being here or anything. And we're talking about getting married soon. So we were thinking that through the marriage that we would also be able to help him get his documents. But now with this executive order, we're thinking, how can this benefit him? And how can we start the process towards legalization or documentation for him?
Cool. Thank you so much for the question. So again, right now we'll explain a little bit about the legislative process. The path to citizenship that Biden has set up is not guaranteed or solid, right? So this is his best effort at trying to start the conversation off from like as good of a place as we can, but nothing that's been proposed yet is law, and there's no guarantee that it's going to become law. We're gonna fight like hell to make sure that, to try to give ourselves as best of a chance of that happening as possible, but there are no guarantees. So in terms of like what is law now, it's the same laws that existed previously, And those are the ones that we kind of have to continue to follow. So happy to talk like offline if there's like more details or more things to kind of discuss with all of this. Again, caveat, not as an attorney, but just as an organizer and trying to figure out best ways of supporting each other. But it is really important to just keep in mind that what Biden provided in terms of path to citizenship is not at all final and is just the start of a conversation. So given that it sounds like people really want to get to that part of the convo, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of threats coming out of Texas and then get into some of the stuff with the legislation. So, you know, of course, we know that these fights are political fights. And so as soon as we're winning, we know that we have to expect the counter punch from the other side. And so, you know, the far right has been really activated and really kind of trying to get different states to take action to try to stop some of these wins. And so the same strategy that happened to try to shut down, for example, folks remember after DACA with some of the lawsuits, right, with having states sue the federal government, something sort of similar is happening with the state of Texas suing to try to get an injunction against the moratorium. That lawsuit was filed on Friday. They were not supposed to get a hearing for a couple of weeks. And then on Sunday, they filed some other documentation and there was a hearing earlier this morning. That hearing, you know, I think we can see really closely the connection between, for example, some of these states and like what's being put out in Fox News and, you know, how all of these motions are always quoting Tucker Carlson. I don't know, but like that is kind of the frame and where they're kind of coming at it from. It's unclear. The judge listened to the hearing, asked a lot of really concerning questions around people being released from detention and other things that kind of give us some indications that who knows if it's how that's going to go. But no order and no injunction has been ordered yet. So a lot of us are still kind of waiting to see what happens with that, to understand what is going to be the path forward in terms of like legally how to fight it. But what we do know is that, you know, the Attorney General of Texas is trying to say that this is not in the best interest of the state of Texas. But we know that there's a lot of community folks who have been organizing in Texas to shut down detention centers, to be able to, you know, fight against deportations, fight against criminalization. So there is a coalition of folks being spearheaded by grassroots leadership in Austin, Texas, that's going to be having a press conference tomorrow to start to raise awareness around this, to start to organize businesses, leaders, community folks to fight back in the state of Texas. And so this is just kind of like a call to folks that, you know, this is a time to support that, lift that up as we're waiting to hear what the legal strategy is going to be on this. Obviously, we're also trying to figure out and working with different legal groups and policy groups to also figure out, you know, if there is an injunction, if there is some sort of order, what is that going to mean, or what are going to be the implications for what that's going to mean for the moratorium? Unfortunately, we don't know yet. I'm in the same boat as y'all. I have been pulling out my hair today, trying to figure out what this is going to mean. But I think this is one of the moments where, again, we just have to kind of figure out what's thrown at us and how we continue to pivot from there, to continue to be really, to continue to expect the administration to really dismantle and overhaul DHS as much as possible, with or without the moratorium, right? Like the way, the phrasing of the memo, the phrasing of the policies, we know that there might be some space there, but the expectation that we have to dismantle this policing system and that we have to continue to push to have, you know, smaller policing agencies, and make sure that there's cuts to CBP, that there's cuts to ICE, that we're shutting down detention centers. Those demands have to continue, whether or not we, you know, this policy is the vehicle for that. So I don't think it's going to be we are definitely not saying that we're going to be in a situation where if there is an injunction, that means we, you know, sit down and back off. If anything, it just means that we have to be creative about how we're asking the administration to make some of these decisions and continue to push back. So that's just kind of giving folks a little bit of context around some of those things. So in terms of organizing steps on the moratorium, just want to kind of highlight again a couple of things that people can plug into if you're interested. So one is, if you know of any case of someone who has an aggravated felony or who might be transferred from local prison or jail to ICE custody in the next 100 days, please let us know. Let's figure out a public organizing strategy. Let's figure out how to support. Let's get people to call to really try to push back against this definition, and use it as a launch pad to try to, fight against the criminalization of our people and make sure that permanent deportation priorities moving forward are actually, including less people and not more. The second thing is, let's fight deportation cases, right? This is the time. If you know that there's one ICE agent that's doing all sorts of stuff, or there's all sorts of fights, let's get into the nitty gritty of actually trying to bring accountability on some of these things. So I think that there might be people who are like, I used to hear about people fighting deportation cases, but I didn't know how to do it. I'm interested in learning. Hit us up, let us know. I think that this is also a time to be bringing in new people to our movement in terms of how we're conducting those things. And the second is, we are working right now on a plan of how to include the voices of those directly impacted, the voices of folks who had to suffer at the hands of ICE and Border Patrol, to create a series of town halls to collect all of the evidence that we know exists against how corrupt and inhumane DHS is, to be able to push around some of these enforcement demands that have existed for a while. So again, shutting down 287G, taking away detainers, stopping surveillance, making sure that we can stop streamlining prosecutions. We want to hear from folks on the ground about how we can stop these things and what has been happening to try to push as much as we can. And we'll be launching a plan on how to do that in the next couple of weeks. So if you think that that sounds great and you're like, I want to organize a hearing in my town or my city or my locality, and I just want to learn more, hit us up, send us an email, and we can kind of take it from there in terms of figuring out other ways of participating in the fight. So that's kind of on the moratorium. I want to get into now a little bit about the day one bill, because I've heard, sounds like there's a lot of folks that have questions around this. We know that, for a long time, folks have been pushing for immigration reform to happen, to be able to create a permanent path to citizenship for communities. There have been also a lot of fights and a lot of discussions about what's the best way to do that, right? And we know that, that some people say we should only have a bill that covers dreamers, and that should be the strategy. Other people say, no, we have to go with the 11 million. Other people say, let's just do TPS. Others people say, let's do a combination of all of the above. For us, it's really been important to say, let's push for a path to citizenship, but let's also make sure that that does not come at the expense of people who might not be included in those bills. So a lot of the focus for Mijente has been on making sure that these categories are as inclusive as possible, that they're not contributing to the overcriminalization of our people, and are not saying that to be able to get some sort of path to citizenship, that means we have to be investing in policing and criminalization. Now, there's been a lot of conversations around the best strategy to get this type of immigration reform. And so what Biden did is he introduced kind of a framework or some top line items of what he thinks should happen. It was really significant for this framework that he's putting out to not include increases in deportations, increases in money for policing, and that type of mentality. However, we do know that within that path to citizenship, one, the same blocks that would exist for people with certain criminal records continue to exist. And so they do say that there will be waivers for people, but it's unclear what those waivers, how broad those waivers are going to be, and how often they're going to be granted. So this is an area where we think we still have to continue to push and do advocacy on, because, obviously there's a huge risk that a lot of people would be ineligible for a type of path to citizenship if the waivers are not generous enough and aren't being used in the right way. Now, this bill is going to be introduced to the Senate by Senator Menendez and then introduced into the House. So this bill is not law in any way, shape, or form. it's actually just the first step of the legislative process. And so that means that, one, we're going to have to convince some middle of the road people who knows what they're going to be asking for in exchange. That means there's going to be attacks from the right. They might try to add things to it that are really, really bad. And then we're going to have to try to figure out how, what that means for our strategy. And so it's just important for people to note that, again, we're just starting the conversation, and this might be a multi-year process. And so I think we both want to keep our people excited. We want to keep our people hopeful, because shit, we know we deserve it after the last 4 years. But we also don't want people to have false hope, right? And false expectations that now everything is great and hunky-dory and we don't have to do anything and just, sit at home and, ahí te van a llegar los papeles, no te preocupes. Nah, this is actually a time to kind of tell our people, this is where we have to do the work, because if we don't do the work, they're going to do the work, and we know what happens when they do the work, right? So this is really a time to get people involved and active. And again, this is where we want to, at the beginning of the conversation, I talked about how important it was to really have people grounded in ideas of fighting criminalization, fighting policing, fighting deportations, fighting this idea that, if we make the border as cruel as possible, that's going to stop people from migrating. We have to continue to push on those conversations, because if not, there's a lot of people that are just going to want to say path to citizenship and not care at what expense. And so that's a little bit of the tricky, the fine line that we have to kind of be able to fight against, where we want to get folks involved. We want to be pushing for a different conversation, but we have to understand that it is still a fight, right? There's nothing that's going to be guaranteed. The new administration is coming in the middle of a pandemic. They have several other priorities, which we're also, let's fight to, we have to get rid of climate. We have so much work has to happen around climate change. So much has to happen around jobs. So much has to happen around COVID relief. And so we know that there's a lot of fights that are going to be had, and we need to keep our people kind of clear and focused on the conversation, and how to continue to push and build power, so that we're also not put in a place where they're fracturing us. Because I do think that in a couple of months, if we start to see people start to split off and do different strategies, that's going to be really difficult. So today, for example, we launched, there's a launch of a new coalition, the We Are Home campaign, that actually includes a lot of different organizations that kind of represent really different perspectives of the immigrant rights movement historically. But I think what's exciting about this moment is that we are starting to see a lot of possibilities of what can happen when we're actually sharing notes with each other and on the same page around some of the principles to be able to make new demands. So y'all are good. You guys start asking questions. I'm about to get there, and the questions are just taking me there. But the other space to kind of be aware of in terms of Congress and sort of what's been going on in Washington, D.C., is this conversation around the budget and appropriations and trying to figure out what interventions can happen there as well. The budget for this year has already sort of been set, but we have a new possibility to be fighting for things moving forward. And this is our chance to really be screaming from the rooftops about how we need a much smaller, we need to get rid of DHS, right? But that means let's start to ask for really drastic budget cuts. Let's try to push things as much as we can to have less agents, to have less detention centers, to have less capacity to be able to enact harm in our communities, and to be able to chip away on all of those things. So there's also a lot of work that has happened through the Defund Hate campaign. These are folks who have been working on the budget process for some time. And I think that there's a lot more possibility to be able to continue to make interventions on that front. So I do think that the conversation and pushing the narrative around why we need to slash these agencies' budgets and be able to kick out as many bodies as we can is going to be incredibly, incredibly important. The last thing I want to say before I open up for a couple closing questions, some folks have asked about, for example, the right to return of folks who have been deported, or what's going to happen with more Can we, for example, advocate for some sort of permanent protection or some sort of like DACA 2.0 that would include more people? The possibilities are pretty endless, but we have to be able to fight and organize to make them possible. So I do think that, again, this is a time where we want to be thinking about how we create the public pressure to be able to defend the wins that we have, but then also continue to push the needle to be able to go forward. So it's hard because we do have to do both. You know, I think sometimes we're either really accustomed to attack or really accustomed to being on the defensive. We have to really exercise this muscle of being able to do both things at once, to be able to both protect the wins that we have gotten so far, make sure that the conversation stays focused on what our communities need and not have these trade-offs. And the clearest place where we have to do that, for example, is around some of these surveillance issues. So in the day one bill, there was this idea of trying to use surveillance and technology to modernize the border. And that's going to be a continued point of struggle. We know that MPP was canceled, but there's a lot of people who are in Mexico still trying to get through. We know that there's a lot of folks, in Central America with both, the political situation, the violence, but also the hurricanes, like folks have been trying to migrate to come. And so there's a lot of other, ways that that's going to continue to be used to, one, either justify inaction or justify more enforcement. And so we have to be able to also continue to push on those fronts, because I think before it was enforcement in exchange for a path to citizenship. I think now what we're seeing is both enforcement and surveillance in exchange for some sort of protections, really sort of sacrificing the border has always kind of been historically done in these conversations. So I think that's kind of the challenge that we're going to have as we try to push forward. So I don't know if there's any maybe taking one or two questions that folks might want to ask on the call before we sort of lay out next steps again and give people an idea of where we're going from here. So anybody want to ask a question on the call?
Yes, ma'am. Kasum Zibo, I have a question.
Sure.
Yes, we know that in the past, the President George Bush tried to get a comprehensive immigration reform. It didn't pass in the Congress. Obama also did the same thing. It didn't work. So now with Joe Biden, what is the chance to get it done in this legislation?
I will say this. I think it's really hard to make political predictions of whether it's going to happen or not. I feel like the last week has been a roller coaster where I'm like, oh, that happened? Oh, that happened? Oh, that happened. So I will say, I wish I had a crystal ball to be able to tell you we have, 30% chance of rain and 60% chance of a path to citizenship. But I think it's a really hard situation. The fact that we were able, I was also, just going back to this is going to be as much as we organize for. I think a lot of us, if you had asked us a couple of months ago whether or not we were going to be able to win both of the Senate seats in Georgia, I would have been like, who knows, right? And we made it happen through organizing. So I think now more than ever, we can't sell ourselves short and lose hope. But again, being able to balance it with political education and kind of a sense of groundedness and organizing fight with our people to be able to get them over the finish line. So is it in the bag? No. Is it really hard? Yes. And do we have also hope to feel like maybe the situation is different? Also, yes. I do think that we have pushed, right? And as a result of that pushing, this administration's taking a different approach to immigration. Again, I think, in some ways there are lessons that were learned from Obama's deport first and try to get CIR later that people kind of are understanding is not working. And so I think we just have to continue to push that, because as we get more attacks from the right, I think that's going to put more folks a little bit more in the center. So, not guaranteed, but I think, you know, if we don't fight, I can guarantee what will happen there. So I think it is just a question of being able to have new possibilities.
All right, thank you.
Frank? Can someone, no?
You should be unmuted, Frank. No, now you're, there you go. Still nothing.
Nothing.
Might be on your end.
So while we figure that out, I just wanted, there's a couple of questions in here around private prisons and detention centers and other things like that. I do want to really just shout out the folks at Detention Watch Network have been doing amazing work pushing against detention centers, and have a campaign that they'll be launching in a couple of weeks to make a final, you know, continue to push on that front. So that's something that we want to be really supportive of. And, you know, I think there's so many possibilities around that are really, really exciting. So that's on detention centers. Around private prisons, you know, we know that one of the other demands that Mijente has been pushing for a long time has been around shutting down Operation Streamline and stopping the prosecutions of folks for crossing the border or coming back to the United States after having been deported. We are anxiously waiting a couple of different orders and different announcements that should be coming out this week, where we're unclear if that's going to include, for example, starting to shut down the use of private prisons. You know, I think 11 out of the 13 private prisons that exist in the federal system for criminal offenses are for non-citizens. So, you know, that would be huge for a lot of for immigration, as well as just shutting down incarceration overall that we want to do. And so, you know, that's another front that we're waiting for. And maybe we'll have another call next week to talk about how what happened there and how we can continue to push around that, because we know that we've really been, calling for shutting down Operation Streamline and stopping all prosecutions, which again, under Trump is higher than 70% of all federal prosecutions, and under Obama was 50%. So if we're able to get that down, like that's also just a good step in the right direction as we're trying to do this. I think there was one question. Is that coming through?
Yes, I have another question regarding to, we heard about the DACA, but this time we didn't hear about the DAPA, D-A-P-A. On Obama time, we heard about the DACA, but this time we don't hear about the DAPA instead of only DACA.
Yep. So DAPA as a program itself has not been kind of brought back up as a demand. I think that in general, folks didn't feel like DAPA as a category was expansive enough as possible. But I do think that there have been folks also trying to push for executive action if, you know, things don't go as planned with legislation. So I do think that that's a little bit kind of a further down the line strategy, but is something that is kind of that folks have been kind of talking about. So just given the time, because I just realized that we are so close to the hour and want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you have any other questions, please.
I have a question. This is Porfirio. I have a question.
A ver, dígame, Porfirio.
Ya, y se la voy a hacer en español. Bueno, hay muchos biles, y la voy a traducir. Hay muchos biles ya en el Congreso. ¿Eso lo van a revivir o van a aparecer otros aparte de lo que va a presentar Biden? Esa es mi pregunta, que si existe esa posibilidad.
Sí, va a haber un montón de diferentes propuestas de cómo tratar de conseguir un camino a la ciudadanía. Entonces, está la propuesta de Biden, ¿verdad? Que el senador Menéndez va a presentar, pero también hay muchos otros congresistas y senadores que están pensando en presentar diferentes opciones que pueden incluir a menos personas que a lo mejor los 11 millones, ¿verdad? Entonces ahí es donde hay múltiples estrategias que están pasando al mismo tiempo y ahí es donde es difícil predecir un poquito lo que va a suceder. No hay de qué. So again, if folks have other questions, if folks want to strategize with your members, if folks are thinking through some campaign ideas, please send us an email. We can definitely set up a time to talk and kind of go from there. I do want to be respectful of people's time and end on the hour right here. But I also just want to make a second plug. If you are interested in participating in doing these town halls to talk around how we have to reduce detention, how we have to end detention, how we have to, continue to attack ICE, how we have to get rid of these police-ICE collaboration programs, please hit us up, send us an email, and we'll be launching that in the next couple of weeks. So want to make sure that we plug people in, give you the toolkit, give you the opportunity. Also, there's a sign up there where you can kind of like make sure that we have your email so that when we do make the public launch, that you get all of the materials. There's a lot of really amazing grassroots groups that are going to kick us off and start the first one to get us moving. But the idea is that for the next 100 days, we got a little organizing sprint, y'all. We gotta tear this down as much as we can. We gotta be able to try to push as far as we can to make sure that this is just the floor, right, of what we can accomplish, and really be able to push for all of the things that our communities need and deserve to be able to get this protection from criminalization and deportation. So it's an honor to be in the fight with all of y'all. Really appreciative of folks jumping on the call and staying in the space, and looking forward to hearing from you. So please hit us up. Send us an email, whether it's a question about, a deportation case or a campaign, or just how to make sense of this or how to talk to your members about it. Again, this is our time to really come together and be able to continue to fight and move forward, because we really needed this hope and this injection of energy after the last long 4 years. And so, just really honored to be in la lucha con todos ustedes. So thank you, everybody.